Hi, this is Austin Wintory. Welcome back to the Game Maker's Notebook and another Nerdy Composer Chat edition. This time I had the pleasure of speaking with Ilan Eshkeri, the British composer who is half of the compositional force behind the incredible summer phenomenon that is the Ghosts of Tsushima. We speak in great length about his process working with Sucker Punch, a little bit about his prior experience in games. He also has a rather extensive pedigree in the world of film, and we cover bits and pieces there and just the nature of art. And then we even get at the end to geek out over a mutual love of space and science. So enjoy.
Welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook, a podcast featuring a series of in-depth one-on-one conversations between game makers providing a thoughtful, intimate perspective on the business and craft of interactive entertainment. The Game Maker's Notebook is presented by the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, a member-driven organization dedicated to the recognition and advancement of interactive entertainment.
I think, as has been the case only one prior time, I don't believe we've ever met in person before. Although we've had some kind of ships in the night moments, like last summer at LA Comic Con, where we had adjacent panels, you talking about your ESA project that I am for sure going to want to talk about, even if it's unrelated to Ghosts of Tsushima. So because of that, I will say, very nice to meet you properly-ish.
Well, yes, great to meet you too.
I appreciate you taking some time to get into it. I think when Ghost of Tsushima was first shown, I did not expect that it would. I didn't know what to expect, I should say, and it has become almost a phenomenon of the summer. So first off, I'll just say congrats on monumentally excellent work on a game that I don't think any of us realized quite the ambitions of, and successfully achieving those, no less. So yeah, congrats, and I'm stoked to be able to get into it.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I had no idea what I was getting into either, and at that first glimpse at that stage, I think that was maybe the very beginning of when Sony were contacting me about it, and you know, I was a little reticent, if I'm completely honest, because I don't really like doing projects that are just about fighting for the sake of fighting, or for the sake of winning something.
Out of curiosity, why is that?
Well, it's not because I've got any big sort of moral point of view on it. I mean, you know, I spent many teenage years playing Mortal Kombat, so it's more just because creatively or artistically, I'm not really sure how I connect with that. I'm not sure what I'm right. I don't know. You know, I feel like certainly in my career, I've done a bunch of action music, and you know, and there's only so many ways you can do a car chase before it gets a bit tiresome, or at least you know, before you need a really long break from it. So I wasn't really that into the idea on the face of it. And then the guys at PlayStation said, the music team at PlayStation said, well, you know, the thing we're interested in is this score that you did for a movie directed by Ralph Fiennes called Coriolanus. And this was Ralph's directorial debut. It was the first time we'd worked together. And he was very nervous of music. And
meaning what? Like the classic director sort of complex that it means there's something intrinsically wrong with the film if there's music playing a large role, or
but 10 times over, because not just the class that director thing of you know, worrying about music and not understanding music and and how it's going to affect their film and feeling like they don't have control of it. But on top of it, you're dealing with one of the great living monuments of Shakespearean acting, and you could kind of see him going, what? How is my performance? Like, what is it that you're going to bring to my performance, right? And what is it that I'm going to bring to Ralph Fiennes' performance of this great Shakespeare play? So it was a really valid question, and so he, I started with okay, we're just going to have these. It was his idea, just these very small bits of percussion.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
although it's worth highlighting to just pause for a moment. I remember that score, and the percussion is not just generic tapping on a drum. It's actually quite interesting and distinctive, and there's kind of a subtle. It feels like a subtle kind of sampling or programming quality to it, where things feel kind of chopped and manipulated, as I remember.
Actually, everything was played live, but there was no reverb on anything.
Oh, is that what? Okay, yeah, because it has a very distinctive, like visceral, on the ear type quality. It doesn't just sound like a nice room full of.
No, exactly. Everything.
I'm amazed there's no splicing going on.
Well, it's not. It's just really limited or really compressed and with no reverb at all whatsoever. And so we just came up with this very extreme idea. And Rafe is, he's a true artist, and we really connect creatively. And whenever I bring an idea to him, he likes to follow through with it to the furthest extreme. And so we always end up doing something interesting together, and I'm grateful for that opportunity. And so what was it to get back to Ghost? What I found amazing was that this very mainstream blockbustery game was interested in this very niche art house movie that I had done, and that I thought, well, if you're interested in that, then that's interesting. So let's have a conversation. Then I went to Seattle and I met with the guys at Sucker Punch, and they sat down and talked me through the story. It was like a sort of multimedia journey through the story. It took about 45 minutes or an hour. And by the end of that, I was completely blown away, because this wasn't a game, a project about slicing people up with a sword. It was about a man who was in emotional crisis, emotional conflict over the ghosts of his past and what he was meant to stand for, and what he needs to do in order to save the home that he loves and the people that he loves. And so I was really taken by that idea, because it's such a sort of powerful emotional place. That meant that all the emotions would be very heightened, and that it would be a great musical opportunity to write something that was powerful.
Sometimes you never know, unless you're kind of there with a glimpse under the hood, just how much those sorts of ideas take shape, or at what point during production those come about, because it's definitely very striking that in the game, I've only been able to play it maybe 6-7 hours, so I'm kind of a reasonable bite into it, but I have the sense that still the vast majority of it is ahead of me, and it's a lot bigger than I initially anticipated also. But still, within that first hour or whatever, the first time it essentially teaches you anything about assassinations, the game sets up, here's a skill we're going to teach you that you're actively not supposed to use, that it runs counter to the kind of ethical framework of the character. And I kept thinking, what a fantastic premise for music. That it's like you said, it's not about the bluster or the machismo, it would be maybe a better way to put it, of the sword play, even though the game is does a really great job of that as well. It delivers on just the kind of, the basics of let's make satisfying samurai combat, but gives it this context. So it's amazing to hear that was sort of the agenda from the start, and not, or at least from the start of when they were speaking to you, and not one of those kind of emergent discoveries as they went.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if that was their agenda, but it was certainly what motivated me. And I find that these days, when I enter into a project, I like to find what is going to inspire me artistically, and then make it very clear to the people that I'm working with that this is the path I want to take, and are they prepared to take that path with me? Because at this point in my life, I want to do work that I really believe in, and that means that sometimes I turn down jobs that probably I shouldn't turn down, but I believe if you do good work, the rest will follow. So I feel like there's got to be a real meeting of minds creatively for me, and both PlayStation and Sucker Punch were really supportive of whatever ideas I threw at them. Not all of them stuck, by the way, but a lot of them did.
No, but I totally understand, and I deeply resonate with that sentiment of wanting to make sure that you feel like you can actually add a stamp. I remember, I think it was David Raxon who once said, if you're scoring a car chase, just anything fast is fine. I remember thinking, what an incredibly reductive attitude, because wouldn't it be more interesting to try to score, why is the car chase happening? It sounds like you were coming from that same place.
I do think that there's a choice if you're going into the profession of writing music to describe stories in whatever format, whether that's film or television or games or theater or whatever it is. I think that there's a choice where you can choose to do something that's quite functional, and if you do that, then maybe what you're doing is more a craft and less an art, and that's completely valid. There's nothing wrong with that.
Is that something that you have felt throughout your career, that distinction and that aspiration?
No, absolutely not. I think that I started young, right? I started more than 20 years ago, working for Michael Kamen and Ed Shermer.
I was going to bring that up. Michael Kamen being one of my longtime heroes. I was continue your point, but I got to hear some Michael Kamen stories, because he's just one of the all-time greats.
Yeah, well, for sure, and I really cherished the time that I got to spend with him, but it was I've forgotten what I was going to say. Yeah, the industry changed quite a lot. I think certainly the film industry changed, and also it became much more. It was very. When I started, nobody even knew what film music. Nobody wanted to do film music, and now it's like a big thing, and lots of people want to do it. And there's courses at colleges on it, and stuff like that. That didn't exist 20 years ago. It wasn't anywhere near as mainstream as it is now. And the way that people make music change. When I started, we were still on 24-track tape, and well, sometimes you're on Sony 48-track digital, but that was really amazing. And then I remember when Pro Tools, still when I was starting out, within the first few years, Pro Tools started to become a thing. So but creatively, it was very different as well, because the director of the film had to trust you, because there wasn't a way to demo things the way that we demo them now, and so that all began to change, and I think as a result the industry shifted, and there's that, and then there's also at the start of your career you've got to take whatever job comes your way, because you're trying to build a name for yourself. So I think there was definitely a point in my career where I looked at what I was doing, and I was like, why have I just spent all this time and energy doing this, and gone through all this sort of effort and pain, and not seeing my pals or my family or whatever to do this bit of work? What is it that I got out of that, aside from a paycheck? And at that point I started to realize, well, actually, what is it that I really want to be doing? And so I started to make some really tough choices and learning to say no, or trying to, for me, it was, also starting to work in ballet and theater and things like that, and trying to effectively make a career adjustment was not easy at all. It was really tough. And in fact, in many ways, I feel like I'm still in the middle of that.
That shift, it's kind of an emotional or even philosophical evolution. Did that correspond to anything? Like you mentioned having a daughter, for example. Like was it on the back of life events like becoming a father, that getting married or whatever, something along those lines, or do you think it just kind of the passage of time?
I had already started thinking about it, but definitely uh, having a child definitely puts certain things in perspective for you. Um, and and so I think that played its part. But I think it was also, I was in a position in my life, a very fortunate position, where I could afford to turn down some work and take that risk.
Right,
And
sure.
and so that was just fortunate that I was able to do that and able to start trying to do other stuff.
Yeah, well, but good on you for actually, taking advantage of that, because that's something that I at least if relating only personally, I struggle with that. I there have been plenty of times where I felt like I don't think this seems like a job I need to do, or this isn't necessarily the best fit. But many years of being hardwired to kind of proactively seek out everything I could led me to saying yes almost just kind of automatically before I had really thought about it. And then halfway through the job, I thought, I don't think this was a very advisory choice.
Yeah,
For anybody.
I totally relate to that. I totally relate to that.
Yeah. So the notion of trying to find something that you really respond with and can you feel like you have something to say. I'm reminded of a friend who once worked with. I suppose I ought to leave their name out of it, but a rather towering figure in the modern concert music world. A friend of mine worked with him for a while, right out of school as his personal assistant. And he said that he got approached, the composer that he was working for got approached by Yo-Yo Ma with an offer of a cello concerto commission, which for most composers would be essentially the most plum opportunity you could imagine.
Yeah.
But he was at a point in his life, in his 70s at that point, where he said, I don't know that I have anything to say with a cello concerto. So he turned him down and turned down Yo-Yo Ma and, untold performances that would have led to, and orchestras, every orchestra on the planet would have had to go around with it. But just trusting his instincts and saying, yeah, I don't know, beyond the physical act of putting notes on the page, which of course I can do, what meaning that will have. And so,
I think that is so interesting. We're sort of getting slightly philosophical here, but I think I love that he said that, because for me, I really relate to that too, because the idea of, and it's kind of exactly what I'm saying about the difference between craft and art. And for me, I'm always looking when I'm putting notes down, what is it? What's the point at which the notes stop just being a bunch of notes and start having meaning? And that's the point where it becomes a tune, where it has a soul. It's greater than the sum of its parts. And I think that's true for if you're a painter, I think it's true of all art. There is a point at which it stops just being what it physically is and starts meaning something. And I find that really fascinating. And that's what I'm chasing. And that's about art. It's about authenticity. It's about, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, and so wonderful that somehow Sucker Punch and Sony kind of seem to intuit that perspective and that philosophy, if they basically laid out a project that was so well attuned to that way of thinking. Were there any aspects of it that felt like, I'm here for X, but I still have to do Y. I mean, because it seemed the score sings with such musicality. I'm not trying to pry dirt out of you if that's what that sounded like, because I don't mean for it to. I just mean sometimes on a project there's sort of the functional bits, and then there's the part that represents the heart and soul of it. But at a cursory listening, from playing the game and then also listening to the album just in anticipation of chatting with you, nothing ever sounds like that. It really sounds very purposeful top to bottom.
Yeah, there wasn't anything like that. And in fact, I wrote probably twice as much music as there is in the game, because there was some ideas that I worked on, instruments that I thought about using, that just ended up not being appropriate for one reason or another, or that just got put to one side. And
all the reggae and dubstep and things didn't make the cut.
Exactly, that saxophone solo.
Yeah, right.
I don't understand why, but that's what they said. Oh no. So I think that's part of the journey. And they definitely had opinions about what they thought worked and didn't work. And so the overall concept I think we really agreed on, but then it was about getting into the detail and sometimes seeing how it looked up against, they'd play a bit of the game with the music and send it back to me, and I'd be like, yeah, actually that isn't fast enough, or that isn't, there is a functionality to it as well. But they also just gave me a lot of creative latitude, which allowed me to be musical every step of the way.
That's unsurprising. I've worked with those folks before, Pete Scaturo, Keith Leary, and I've never worked with Sucker Punch, but on the Sony side at least, this allegiance towards musicality and expressiveness is something that they hold quite dear. I'd love to, just for broader context, obviously you have a rather lengthy film resume, and I'm still going to angle my way into some Michael Kamen stories and Ed Sheeran and those early days. But just out of curiosity, where does your sort of musical story begin, just in life as a kid, and what kind of set you on this path at the start?
Well, I played violin from the age of 4. My mum wanted me to play the violin because her father, who died before I was born, he played the violin. In fact, I still have his violin, and so both me and my brother learnt violin, and my mum's a talented pianist. And so my earliest memories of learning the violin and listening to my mum play Chopin. She was played a lot of Chopin waltzes and etudes and stuff, and it was a very classical childhood. My mum didn't really listen to much pop music, and then my brother's 5 years older than me. So when he was, in his, 12, 13, he was into 80s pop music. And so that was a big influence on me. And then I got a guitar when I was 13, and two things happened. I got a guitar, and I got into Iron Maiden and Metallica and Megadeth, and but also NWA and Public Enemy exploded onto the scene. And so I got into that as well. And then, I was fortunate, I was a teenager. I was right in the middle of my teenage years when Nirvana exploded onto the scene. I can remember exactly where I was standing when I heard Teen Spirit for the first time. And then in my early, and then there was the Britpop thing, and then in my early 20s there was a huge dance music thing in the UK. It was a bit it predated the sort of EDM thing in the States, and so I was really into my techno and my trance and my drum and bass, and
Were
in
you
my.
trying your hand at making your own, or was this purely just as a music lover consuming all this as ravenously as you could?
Yeah, just as a music lover, but no, I totally tried making dance music, drum and bass and stuff. Yeah, absolutely. We messed about with that, and also as a teenager, I was in bands with my friends. We used to write songs and stuff. And really, what I really wanted to do is I wanted to be a guitarist in a rock and roll band. That's what I really wanted to do. But I really wanted a job in the music business, and through friends of friends, I got introduced to Ed Shermer, and then I got introduced to Michael Kamen.
At what age did you? It sounds like.
I was 19 when I
Oh
met
wow!
him. Maybe 20, maybe 19, maybe 20 when I met Michael.
So you were still, I guess, at a kind of crossroad of deciding if any of this was going to be practical, and like, were you ever sort of wavering on the thought of I might have to go, quote, get a real job?
Well, I was, completely determined. I mean, if I knew then what I know now, I probably wouldn't have been so determined. But no, I was completely determined to do it. And but of course, nobody around my parents certainly didn't think it was a good idea. And even I can remember even after I did Layer Cake, which was the Matthew Vaughan's directorial debut, which was
Mm.
my first feature film, and I had my name on posters all up and down the country. Even after that, I remember my dad being like, "Okay, well done. I'm impressed. You've proved your point. Now, can you get a real job?"
Wow. If only you'd
So,
have been able to grab them by the shoulders and say, "You don't know it yet, but that's freaking James Bond."
yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
Well, so then you say it was friends of friends that led you to Michael Kamen. It's possible that listeners of this, sadly, tragically, criminally, might not be too aware of who he is or who he was. He died many decades too young from complications associated with multiple sclerosis, but he was one of the biggest composers in Hollywood of the 90s and late 80s with the Die Hard films and Lethal Weapon and Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and the list is extensive. And to me, he's
But
a
can I
very
also just to throw in
please.
there that
Oh
also
no,
he did all the strings on the Pink Floyd records. He toured with David Bowie.
well,
I
and the
remember
Metallica
doing,
S&M album is for me
yeah, I
the
remember doing string arrangements with him for Bob Dylan. Like,
oh wow.
he was mates with every rock and roll legend.
Oh
You
yeah.
know,
Yeah, I
he
mean,
was.
Clapton is a featured performer on the Lethal Weapon scores as a perfect
e,
demonstration of that.
Exactly. So he always had his feet planted firmly in both worlds, and he wrote ballet and concerto. He wrote a guitar concerto for Eric Clapton, and
Mhm.
so he did all these different things, and I think maybe that's what made me think, yeah, it's possible that I could do all this different stuff, and why I have formed close relationships with rock and roll bands and done all these different things.
Yeah, he's a hell of a hero to have, and to be able to have worked with him is astonishing. He's one of those folks I always wish I'd had the chance to meet because, being in LA, I have the occasion pretty regularly to chat with the studio musicians who played for him a lot, and everyone just always has the absolute best things to say about. He was just the most fun to work with. He was deeply musical. It's so funny given his relationship with all these bands and sort of legendary rock stars that he went to Juilliard to study oboe. It's not usually that doesn't usually set one on the path towards being one of the coolest people in the room, to be blunt. But he was everywhere he went. He was always everybody's kind of
Yeah, he was such a
favorite.
larger than life character, and he was, he was a brilliant entertainer. There was always fabulous dinners and people around his house and amazing bottles of wine, and he really knew how to live life well in every imaginable way, and that was a great thing to learn too.
Yeah, it's astonishing. I so often find myself wondering if he were still around, what kinds of films, where he would have evolved to as a composer and as an artist, and as especially with this just innumerable giant blockbusters like the Marvel films and whatnot. And I always thought it would be so interesting if it could have his own stamp on that world, and because he was so different from all the other composers. And when he would do, a big action movie or a big kind of thing, it just never sounded like anybody else. Yeah, huge loss. The thing that's also interesting to me, though, from if I obviously, I don't know. I guess I should phrase it as a question. It seemed like you actually were rather short-lived, though, in that span of working with he and Ed Sheeran and folks, because your career seemed to get rolling
It, it,
in relatively short order.
well, I mean, it felt like a long time, to be honest, at the time. But and also I should add that that there was Michael Price, the composer, and James Brett. They were actually Michael's assistants
Mm.
full time, and I was on the periphery of that. So I did work with Michael, and had some great experiences. And then when those guys left, I also helped out. But there was also another guy called Rupert. So I don't want to paint a picture that wasn't
No,
complete.
understood.
But like I said, there weren't that many people. We were all pals, and we were the guys who were doing that stuff, and other people would come from LA, and we'd help them out. And so, I ended up working with quite a few different people at the start. But yeah, I did get quite lucky early on. I suppose. I was when I did Layer Cake. I was 20. I was 26 or 27 when I did Layer Cake.
Yeah, it's a running start, and then only a couple years later, the film that brought me, as someone who's just always been fascinated by the composer community and been a soundtrack nerd from very early memories, and still wear that label as a badge of honor, despite having less time these days to be the collector that I once was. I've known your work for quite a while, and like many folks, I think it was Stardust that put you on my radar. Although it was not long after that, there was a film called The Young Victoria that made me go, that seems like that Ilan fellow. He seems like a solid, reasonable composer to saying, okay, I think this is a real composer. This is someone who knows their way around different idioms, different languages. They can converse musically with different vocabularies, and so it seemed like you had these wonderful opportunities to kind of explore, and musically, I mean, from the get go, which is inspiring to say the
Well,
least.
well, you know what? I think it's also just lucky, right? There's a lot of hard work, there's a lot of luck, and there's a bit of talent, but you kind of need all three of those things to come together.
Yeah, God knows that I punt all achievements and accolades to luck on a daily basis, because it's the operative thing that's easy to overlook, and it often feels like that's all that was going on. When you look around at folks that are working just as hard and somehow don't quite have the same opportunities, it's hard not to say, well, I may have just gotten lucky. But you do have to have the ability to capitalize on that luck, and to kind of build and grow, which you have. So hats off on that. But migrating back into the realm of games, then I also became aware at some point in years past that you were working on The Sims. I worked with some of the same folks at EA, and I remember saying, who did? I was like, I heard some random cue. I said, who did that? They said, oh, Ilan Eshkeri. And I said, I didn't know he did games. Was that your first kind of entry point to scoring games, or is there something I don't know about?
Well, there is something you don't know about, which is that
I should say
shortly
there are
after,
many things I don't know about, but illuminate me on at least one of them.
shortly Layer Cake, I got into a conversation with PlayStation UK, about doing a game that never saw the light of day. And what's funny about that is I did work on a trailer for it, and like I say, the game didn't happen. But some of those relationships that I formed back then have turned into very, very good friends. One of them is part of a directing duo called Bert and Bertie, and she's still a very good friend of mine. And then some other people who still work at PlayStation now, all these years later, albeit much, much more senior. And and I didn't work with them directly on Ghost, but it was nice to sort of connect back to those guys. So it wasn't. I always wanted to work in games. I always saw games as the next step in. I see what I do as telling stories through the medium of music. It's narrative based music, and I think storytelling is the oldest of human art forms, right? It began with cave painting, and then it probably moved on to some kind of song singing about what you did, and then there was theater, and then there was opera or ballet, and then somebody invented movies, and then after that somebody invented video games, but really it's just the same thing. It's just another medium with which we do the oldest thing. We're telling a story, and I always saw it that way, and I just wanted to be part of that world,
Well, and you mentioned playing Mortal Kombat growing up. So to some extent, you were also a gamer yourself. Was that a big part of your life next to Nirvana and playing guitar?
Well, totally. I mean, I can remember my dad coming home with a VIC-20. I must have been 6 years old or something. It had some very primitive games on it, but we spent hours doing that. And then we had a Commodore 64, and you had to load the games on a cassette. And I can remember spending my summer holidays in the arcade playing Outrun with my mum, trying to grab me and my brother to go to the beach, and so yeah, I mean, gaming was a huge part of my life, and up until, I don't know, Sega Mega Drive, Sonic the Hedgehog, Mortal Kombat. I think when I got to university, we were still playing Mario Kart, but sort of less so. And then after my very early 20s, I don't really remember playing video games very much. I don't know why. I think I got. Those games didn't have narrative stories in the way something like Ghost does. The gaming wasn't as developed as that, and so I think maybe I lost interest. I don't know why. It just I just stopped.
Were you able to kind of follow the industry to any extent? Like a better way to phrase this would be, were you aware in the intervening years the growth and the development of the industry and the maturing of it, especially as a storytelling art form? Because I mean, there are games with phenomenal narratives going all the way back to the beginning, but you are right that the early history of games, I think, placed.
I was aware that how it had developed, for sure. Like I say, I was in touch with guys at Sony, and I'd wanted to do games, and I knew all about it. But I don't know. I was really impressed by. I wasn't expecting the story of Ghost to be so compelling. It's as good a story as anything I've ever come across. Like, I mean, opera, film, ballet.
Sure.
So, and in fact, it is kind of a very operatic story in many ways. So I was really impressed with the level of focus on story.
So beyond the narrative aspect and just the emotional resonance with the story, with the characters, one of the big talking points of the game is this devotion to authenticity culturally, and I clearly that extended to music. I came across reference just from Instagram of the kind of research that you did. But before we even get into that, correct me if I'm wrong, but you came into this already having kind of swam a little bit in these waters. Even the idea of like a samurai story. I remember the movie 47 Ronin, for example. I have no idea. I don't remember. I don't think I ever heard the score, but I know that there's at least that. And the part that also really surprised me was that you have, and again, fill in the gaps of my ignorance, but you've collaborated in the past with Shigeru Umebayashi. So it seems like there was actually some precedent of sorts to this, or fragments of precedent to this project in various ways. Is it fair to say?
On the face of it, yes, but actually, 47 Ronin was. I mean, it's based on a true story, but really, that film was just a big Hollywood fantasy adventure, and the score for it was a big symphonic Hollywood fantasy adventure, and I sure I used a bit of shakuhachi and a bit of koto, but I didn't really trouble myself with trying to work out what those instruments actually did. In fact, I bent them quite out of shape, and it was quite difficult to record them because I just wrote what I wrote and got them to play it. But the focus of those films wasn't authenticity. The focus was write a big fantasy epic, and the score I did with Ume was very early on in my career. With it was Hannibal Rising, the prequel to the Hannibal Lecter movies, and we collaborated a little more closely on that score.
How did that come to be? How did that collaboration, just to kind of, because that's a story I never came across, is how the two of you ended up together on that film.
The film was being produced by Dino De Laurentiis, who was one of the great Hollywood movie moguls. He made early movies with Fellini, and he just gave Schwarzenegger his first role in Conan the Barbarian, and he made Barbarella and Flash Gordon, and he was really like one of the greats. And by the time I got to work with him, he was in his 90s, and he just in the story in Hannibal Rising, there's a Japanese influence on Hannibal. So we had this idea that parts of the score would be contributed to by Ume, and so that's when we collaborated. And then on Ghost, it was kind of different because the PlayStation and Sucker Punch had a very clear idea about what they wanted Ume to do and what they wanted me to do, and our paths didn't really cross apart from for a really very memorable and fabulous dinner in Tokyo.
That's interesting.
But I have a lot of respect and admiration for Ume. He's an incredible composer, so I'm really proud to be able to share credit with him again.
So does that mean that it was, because I remember talking with I think it was Keith at Sony who said that they were really fond of the House of Flying Daggers score, and that was at least a big part of what excited them to bring him to the table, which would almost suggest, assuming that's accurate, that would suggest that it's actually kind of coincidental that you guys had worked together in the past because you were independently of interest.
Yeah, it was a complete coincidence. You're absolutely right. It was completely coincidental.
Yeah, that's so funny, since these, your career, at least from again, my limited depth, but just it's relatively normal that composers tend to do things alone, and so those collaborations, or if not direct collaboration, the carving up of a project amongst multiple people, it tends to be less common. And so it's just very funny that of all the composers in the world to have this kind of duo twice, for without any kind of partnership as the pretense as to why is funny. And I wouldn't have guessed that. As soon as I saw the two of you, I thought, oh, this must somehow relate to Hannibal Rising. Shows what I know. That's very funny.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's you would think so, but it's just life takes funny turns, doesn't it? Who knows? It's just there must just be written in the stars somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe we've got a third unsuspecting collaboration coming our way some point in the future.
Well, it seems like they come around about once a decade or so you may have to be patient for it. But I'm curious. Other than your apparently fabulous dinner in Tokyo, were you exposing him to your material and vice versa? So if not direct collaboration, was there that kind of sharing of ideas?
No, not at all. We literally worked separately from each other.
And why was that? Why was that pitched that way, or would you just like how aware were you? Basically, is actually a better way to ask that question. How aware was that was going on?
When I came on board the project, I made it. I said that I was very happy to collaborate in whatever way they wanted me to with Ume, and that I was very open to that kind of collaboration. I also made it very clear that I wanted, I wanted it to be a happy collaboration, because there's potential for people to get upset or to feel sidelined or anything like that, so I would not be prepared to work in a competitive way where I worked on one thing and he worked on the same thing, and that's not
that would be very odd.
I'm not up for that kind of thing. So
have you ever been in that boat? Because I would have been astonished if Sony was interested in that. So
yeah, I know, and now knowing I just met these guys at that point, so I was just making it very clear what kind of collaboration I would be up for. But they decided to just split it out into Ume's going to do this, you're going to do that, and don't worry about it, we'll make it work. And so I was really I was really happy with that. I was like, okay, that's fine, I'll just get on with the bits.
How much, just as a kind of pragmatic question, how much music did that end up being at the end of the day?
I mean, I did 100 and something minutes of music,
and his was. The impression I have is that he didn't. It's slightly asymmetric in that, especially particularly all the kind of systemic end game stuff seemed to largely fall on your shoulders, and so that maybe yours is more than half of the score. In other words,
I think that might be true, but I don't think you can add art up in that way.
It's certainly not a scoreboard. If that sounded like that's what I was implying, I'm just curious.
No, I know, but you could write a pop song with somebody, and all they wrote was a sort of 4-note riff, but that might be the thing that made the song, right? And so whose contribution was,
you got me there. I would never disagree. I mean, Leonard Bernstein was the one who eloquently pointed out that, one of the greatest contributions to Western civilization was Beethoven writing 4 notes, 3 of which are the same note. So it's
right, exactly.
It's I definitely don't ask with any kind of pretense of value judgment on that. I'm just always curious how these things are made, purely logistically, and sort of how the work gets divided up, especially in the realm of the idea of composer teams, team in the loosest sense, but just like a collective of people contributing to a project. I've been on both sides of that, and or I should say across the spectrum of that, where it's, as you described, also very team-based, very collaborative, where it's the composition crew is one unit, trying to conquer the score, and then of course the normal pattern of doing things alone. And so yeah, it's fascinating to me. Again, a tribute to the good casting, I suppose, of you and Ume, and also just of the vision presented from both Sony and Sucker Punch, because it doesn't come across in game as a back and forth between two different approaches to this story. That would always be the concern that I would have, if nothing else, just as a gamer, that it's kind of like, oh, I'm in the Ume part, now I'm in the Ilan part, but it never comes across that way. In fact, if it weren't for the soundtrack album, it would be difficult to know where one starts and stops, which is interesting because it's also not that the two of you are generic composers that are easily interchangeable, but it just seems that both really clued into the vision effectively of the studio. And again, I might be projecting here, but that's my read on it.
No, I think you're right, and I think the fact that it works is really credit to the PlayStation team.
Yeah, how involved? I mean, the impression I got, and also just from past experience working with them, is that it's a pretty tight knit collaboration, and that they are kind of co-producers start to finish.
Yeah, they are absolutely, but whilst also allowing a tremendous amount of creative freedom.
Were you used to that level of involvement from the folks on that side relative to film experience?
Yeah, because I got to say, the way that I look at these things is it's always collaborative, right? If I'm working on any project, then if I'm writing a ballet, then the choreographer is my collaborator. He's my artistic collaborator, and I want to know everything he's doing or she's doing, and I want them to know everything I'm doing, and for us to create together, but in our different, focusing on our own things. And I feel the same way. We spoke about Rafe Fiennes, but when I collaborate with Rafe, I feel, completely. I feel like it's completely legitimate for me to comment and discuss things that are outside of the music, as well. I feel like we're just a big team trying to make a bit of art together, and so I actively encourage as much involvement from everyone as possible, so that you feel like you're a team, you're making something together.
I really couldn't agree more. That particular line of reasoning comes up a lot when discussing games. There are composers, like young composers asking for career advice, will often put to me the question if it's important that they be gamers in order to score games. And I always try to say, well, look, no one can tell you who you need to be or what you need to use your time doing. But if I was a game developer, I would feel far more comfortable collaborating with someone that really understands this medium and engages with it less as a composer who just writes music that's almost coincidentally for games, but as a game developer who specializes in music. In the same spirit as what you're describing, where you're working on a film and you are a filmmaker who happens to be contributing the score. And that kind of gives you a license to throw in a comment about that cut, or what the implication of that shot framed that way by the DP versus this other shot might have, or the color timing or whatever. And so too, those people might have thoughts on the music that you would, take interest in.
But and of course, you're absolutely right, because at the end of the day, what you're doing is the job is to express a narrative, an emotional narrative through the medium of music. But what you're doing is you're telling a story, and you're not just a composer, you're first and foremost a storyteller. And I think people who want to get into this kind of work have to acknowledge that. I think, when I've talked a lot to film composing students over the years, and I'm always amazed in these courses that reading a book on how to write scripts, how to structure story isn't part of the
yeah, no kidding.
Because I think, well, that's got to just be a basic, fundamental thing. You need to understand the medium in which you're working, and you need to understand that telling the story is more important than writing the music. It's the same if you're a costume designer. If really what you wanted to do was make clothes, then you'd be a fashion designer. You wouldn't be a costume designer. If what you want to do is tell stories through the medium of film or theater, then you'll be a costume designer.
I really couldn't agree more, especially that idea of go read a book on screenwriting and a book on editing and a book on directing. And I always thought I was unusual at first because I just loved the art of filmmaking so much that even though I had no directorial aspirations or I never wanted to be in the edit bay, that kind of thing, it was so fascinating to get to hang out with those people on every project, and it makes you a better composer. So I guess the natural place that leads to then is, how much were you able to integrate with the team? You mentioned at one point that they would send you clips of the music in the game, and that you could kind of react and rewrite or rethink things in response. Were you able ever to get builds of the game to play it in progress? And
No, they kept that stuff very close to them. I did play it when I went to visit them. I played it, a very very sort of early version of it. Um, but no, I didn't get to play it as I was going along. And also, PlayStation were the music team at PlayStation. They were all over the sort of implementation of the music into the engine. And that stuff, the technical side of that really fascinates me, and I think that bit's quite important, because when that's the thing, that's the skill that you need to develop that differentiates game music from
absolutely.
from all other genres, is that you need to think about how your music can be deconstructed and put back together. And every bit that you're writing, often if you write a pop song or anything, the viola line, it's just a filler, right? It's not doing anything interesting. But I find that in writing game music, every line needs to be able to potentially stand alone. And so you're having to work in this sort of almost, it's not just linear, it's like got a third dimension. It's not just about time passing, it's got a sort of vertical dimension of these different bits that need to be able to work together in different ways. And I think that musically, I think we're still at the dawn of that. I think that is a skill that I'm fascinated by. It's a great it's a technical challenge, but it's also an artistic challenge. And I think there's a long way to go with that, and a long way to go with developing the engines that can use those things and the rules of how that's all going to work. I think that's a really exciting creative place.
Well, you're certainly in my sandbox when we have this discussion, because that's kind of my central focus as a composer on games, is these interactive systems. And it seems I haven't been able to play the game enough to really kind of get my teeth in to figure out, what kind of interesting tricks that you all came up with. But how much was that approach, or how much was the approach to the implementation sort of spelled out, where they told you, okay, here's the way we're going to kind of plug into this system? Or were you able to kind of back and forth a bit and say, oh, well, what if the music did this when the player did that, and kind of develop something more proprietary?
I did not really get to get in. I didn't get to delve into it in that way. I was really focused on the artistic end of it. And so I would say, well, I'm going to write it in this way, and will that be useful? Will that be, it was a bit of, of course I do this in The Sims as well, but doing it this with in this way on this game was a bit of a learning curve for me. And so I didn't get that deep into the structure of the, of how it was going to be playing back. But artistically, I thought in a lot of detail about how the different elements would interact with each other within within the structure of the music, and how I would write it so that it would work easily within the game engine. There were some basic things where, because the instruments are not chromatic, in sort of feudal Japanese instruments, they're not chromatic, so you would just be stuck in a scale. So if you wanted to write something with authenticity, you would just be writing it in a 5-note scale the whole way through. So I wrote a lot of music like that, and and that of course made it very easy for different bits to go with other bits, and because they were all the same five notes, you weren't going to get uncomfortable
Yeah,
clashes.
that's true.
um, so that, I mean, that's a very basic thing, but then I was very careful to make sure that that it would have been really easy to take the taiko drum parts and just have them booming away in the background, and when when the track's going full pelt, then you probably wouldn't be able to tell the detail of what's going on with taiko drums. But the taiko drums are always either with or mirroring parts that are within the rhythmic parts that are, the cellos will be playing a rhythmic part, and the taikos will have the answering phrase to that rhythmic part. So there's a lot of play between the instruments and the sections, and so I think that really was useful for them to be able to put that into the engine, and for it to work well, and to still, once it's deconstructed, for it to still feel musical. And that's really where my head was going.
Yeah, and that challenge can be borderline insurmountable sometimes, because in order to make things maximally fractal, they can become sort of just little Lego bits that don't seem to have much intrinsic musicality, and there have been many scores that sacrificed their musicality and their lyricism and expressiveness on the altar of interactivity, but then also plenty others that sacrificed all player agency and interactivity on the altar of musical expressivity. So I think because of that, and just that the challenge, you are spot on to say that it's still, the art of interactive music still has a long way to go. As incredible as the gains have been till now, that challenge, that fundamental kind of almost oxymoron that's baked into the premise of it, is daunting. But that's why I was curious to learn more, because it's so elegant when you play the game and you listen to the music. It like both the album presentation and the experience of it in the game. It's just classy, It doesn't feel like, oh yeah, well, we're just kind of cutting along drum patterns and a lot of the kind of lazy tricks. Sorry, go ahead.
What was I feel like, and you've done more work in games, so you can tell me what you think, but I there was something that happened a few years before that I think that set me up for this in a useful way, which is that I was writing a contemporary ballet, and it was going to go on tour. And I said to the MD of the ballet company, I said, well, what instruments can I have? What's the instrumentation? Because it's going to be limited because they're on tour. And he thought for a second, and he said, I tell you what, you can have one of every instrument, which meant I could have one flute, one oboe, one clarinet, one bassoon, one horn, one trumpet, one trombone, one first violin, one second violin, one viola, one cello, one bass, one percussion, one keyboard. And I thought,
unblendable ensemble, basically.
I was like, that is a hell of a challenge. I mean, that's really quite difficult. But I loved it. And the way
Stravinsky
that
feeling, in a sense.
Yeah, but the way that I approached it is I had this idea that I would write these bits of music, and I would write a line for one instrument, a phrase, 8 bars or 16 bars, and that instrument would just repeat that phrase over and over again, exactly the same, just getting louder the whole way through the piece. And after one time through that phrase, another instrument would join in and play another phrase that didn't necessarily go very well. It didn't seem like it was that linked to it, but went with it nonetheless. And then another instrument would join, and another instrument would join. And some of them were melodic patterns, some of them were more textural things, but every instrument played its own phrase and played it over and over and over again till once it joined in till the end of the piece.
Sort of a Terry Riley concept in a way, I suppose.
Maybe. I was just, it's just what I came up with, and then of course the great thing is that you break, there are points at which you just decide to break the rule.
Right.
But then after that, I did a TV show and with the director I've worked with a few times before, and in this TV show there was a lot of different characters and they were all woven in with each other. And I said to him, I tell you what, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to write you one piece of music, and it's going to start, each line of music is going to be a different character, and they're just all going to stack on top of each other in a way that sounds like they shouldn't fit together, but they do fit together, and it's going to build up into this big dramatic thing. And I said, and then I'm give you all those separate parts, and you cut it in. In the end, that was a very ambitious idea, and he really tried to do it. He really went for the idea, and I really am grateful to him for that. But in the end, we wrote 6 pieces of music for an 8-part TV show, and that was it, and used them in different ways, but all with this exact same idea. And when I started writing the combat music for Ghost, I applied exactly the same principle. And it's just been a challenge for me, a way for me to write. But I think applying that principle was very, very effective for putting it into the game engine.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the ability to be simultaneously modular, but linear is a trick. Yeah, what an amazing.
So I think it's a really good. It only came because of that ballet project, but I think it's a really good exercise for people if they want to get good at this kind of writing.
What's cool though is the mention of Terry Riley, one of the founders of minimalism, was that those modular bits often, part of what makes pieces like In C or Music for 18 Musicians work is because each bit, by and large, is somewhat innocuous, so that it's all about the aggregate effect of everything coming together. But what's interesting is that's not how I would describe the Ghosts writing. It's not like it's just a bunch of bricks that are getting stacked on top of each other that individually don't have much to say or comment on. I actually am surprised to hear this kind of backstory to the compositional process, because it doesn't make that impression, which is to your credit.
Well, it's only for the combat music, but it is like that. But I just got to a more, having done it 3 or 4 times, I got to a more complex place with it, where the structures that repeated were really complicated. They would be like 4-part structures, and then they'd repeat. But yeah, it just got more increasingly complex. But yeah, I mean, I could show you, I could break it down. It is all built that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's you're as a unapologetic music nerd. I'm one of those unafraid to say, oh God, give me a score, I want to get into it. But something that's kind of related to this, but since you mentioned the limitation, intentionally limiting it to, the kinds of scales that would have been true to feudal Japan, what was kind of the nature of the research? What did you go in feeling like you already had a grasp on? The obviously anything orchestral is automatically not feudal Japan. So then there's also the related question of when and where do you kind of lean one versus lean the other? How much was that a struggle? I'm kind of giving you a buffet to choose from here, but walk me through.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the first thing I did is I started to try to understand how do these, what are the main scales? I met up with this amazing professor, one of the sort of leading scholastic people on Japanese music. His name's Dr. David Hughes, and he was incredibly generous with his time and taught me a lot. And one of the first things I realized is that, well, as far as I could tell, there's 2 main pentatonic scales that they use. I mean, I'm really no expert. I've just got enough knowledge, small enough knowledge to be dangerous,
sure.
but there's two, and there were two main scales that I used, and but it's sort of they just have five notes, right? But the shakuhachi can play these five notes, and that's what it's designed to do. And you get shakuhachis in different keys, but it can also bend up to a note, and it can overblow a note.
Mm-hmm.
So you have those five notes, but you've got a semitone below and a semitone or potentially a tone above as well. And the koto has those five notes, but it has you could bend the string so that it can go up a semitone or perhaps a whole tone. And so they are pentatonic, but there's flourishes that you could put in around the pentatonic thing. And so I had to learn all of this. It was very time consuming, and then sit with the players and have them show me what worked and what didn't work. And, and just try to understand culturally, I got to work with this Japanese musician who lives in the UK called Joji Hirota. And he's incredible and, plays a variety of instruments, but he's an amazing percussionist. And he talked about this idea that, the sounds of nature are part of the sound world of the music, like the obvious example is wind chimes. The bird tweeting and the wind blowing is part of the sound of it. So that was in my head the whole time I was writing. There were all these different things that I needed to learn, and then learning about the folk music from the island. And then one of the most amazing discoveries for me was the biwa, which is the instrument that the samurai used to learn to play, and they used to sing tales of their exploits on it. And I may be romanticizing this story a little, but I think it's accurate that as the tradition of the samurai disappeared in the sort of after the Second World War, or maybe a bit before then, the tradition of playing this instrument also disappeared until there was only one great master of it left. And that great master taught a handful of people who are still around today. And one of those people is this lady, a Japanese lady who lives in Spain, and her name's Junko Ueda. And she's a really spiritual and powerful musician. And she came from Spain. Luckily, we didn't have to get her to come from Japan. And she came from Spain and spent a day with me, showing me around this instrument and performing extracts of famous pieces for me and singing. And it's an amazing instrument.
Were you able to work with her on the score?
Yeah, it's in the heart of the Jito opens with her playing this piece of music that is an incredibly famous piece of music based on the heike, which is a text that everyone learns at school in Japan, and it's a dead cool instrument. It comes with this giant plectrum that is like the size of a fan. and you whack the instrument with it quite, often really hard, and so that was an amazing discovery. And so I learned all this stuff, and I really spent time learning from the musicians. And then there was the orchestra. You have, tried to look at other composers. There's a very famous Japanese composer called Takemitsu. Mm-hmm. He said it's not possible to really combine the Japanese instruments with the Western instruments. And he wrote pieces for both, but it would typically have a bit of orchestra, then a Japanese instrument, then a bit more orchestra. And
I didn't realize there was almost a philosophical belief in a way that they couldn't intermingle, because I've always found it curious. I never looked into why this was. I always found it curious that he seemed to alternate in an almost binary way between the two modes of thinking, as it were.
Yeah, but the thing is that the Western music is chromatic, and so you got 12 notes, and Japanese music has got 5 notes, and so that is hard to combine. And so my solution was I'm going to, and also there's no tradition of chords or a harmony in the way that we have in Western music,
right?
And so I thought, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write everything for the symphony orchestra in pentatonic scales. So everything that they play is playable on a Japanese instrument, and that's how I'm going to ground it in a sort of foundation of authenticity. And to solve the chord problem, I made chords out of the pentatonic scales, and I developed an entire chord system and rules for how I would use these chords, or how I would build these chords, and and it kind of worked great because what it meant is that you had lots of chords that were notes that were next to each other, like a second apart, as that you'd have for the muso nerds out there, you'd have your root, a fourth, and then a second, or your root, a fourth, and a fifth. And that would be a clashy chord. But of course, the emotional context of it was all about being, clashing together. So that worked really well. It was very emotive. And then there were the points at which I would just throw the rule book out the window, and those make for powerful moments too. But for the most part, like for example, The Way of the Ghost, that piece of music has 5 notes in it from beginning to end, nothing else. It's a very pure conceptual composition in that way.
I've always loved that kind of. It's like Bach, you start with 3 notes and you write an hour of music, and I that the economy of material and stretching yourself to not kind of just slather on more novelty, but to really stick to some kind of pure heart is a challenge most composers are not up to, and it's I didn't realize just how kind of strict you were about it, because you can definitely hear when listening to it that there are, especially harmonic rules of this nature, but I wouldn't have guessed that you were that strict with yourself, and that's awesome. I love hearing that. Were there ever moments where you kind of waffled on this? For example, there's an intimacy to a lot of these instruments, the koto and shakuhachi, and like they invite a reflectiveness and an intimacy that the symphonic orchestra sort of represents the opposite of. And obviously you have a wide spectrum of emotions to cover where it will be obvious when maybe one is more appropriate than the other. But were there ever cases where it wasn't actually obvious if this should be a big moment or a small moment, or it should lean on the Japanese soloist, or if the orchestra should be a bigger voice in it, that kind of thing?
I think for the most part it was quite clear. There was a couple of cut scenes where we went around them a couple of times to get them right, and tried it big, tried it small. It's part of the journey, working that stuff out. But I always wanted to highlight the solo, the Japanese instruments. It was always all about them, and the orchestra was always an accompaniment. And then sometimes, like in a violin concerto where it's all any concerto, and they play the solo instrument plays the tune, and then the orchestra plays it huge, and that's really satisfying. But it's still the orchestra is still secondary, because when you hear it huge, you've somehow still got the memory of the solo playing it. And so I was trying to do that with it, so that you were always focused on the Japanese instrument and not on the orchestra for the sake of the orchestra.
Yeah, it's funny how that it really does seem to come through. Sometimes we start off with these lofty ambitions of the kind of sort that you're talking about, but then just the reality of delivering the score forces us to kind of just become a little bit more practical, or have to sidestep some of that just in the effort to deliver. And it's just so wonderful to hear that you pulled it off.
But that's where it comes back to sort of earlier in our conversation, where I was saying, be careful, choose carefully who you collaborate with. And I set out right at the start, this is how I'm going to do it. This is what my approach is going to be. Are we are we all on board with this? Because let's really commit to this idea. Let's commit to a purity of concept, of artistry, so that we can do something amazing. And to the credit of PlayStation and Sucker Punch, they really supported that. A funny aside story, that just thinking about that though, the trouble with trying to work in a musical culture that is not something that you don't really know and that you don't really understand, that you're just trying to learn about. So you could definitely make some pretty bad mistakes. There when I was writing for the taikos, I found that there's a whole bunch of words, about 40 words, that they say traditionally as to get them from one bit to another bit, or just for effect, just as part of the music. But there's quite specific sounds, but they don't mean anything. They're just syllables.
I didn't realize that.
And so I used them in the track "We Are Samurai," and when we were recording with the taiko ensemble in Japan, they started doing these chants, and halfway through, they just burst out laughing, like literally just fell about in hysterics. And somehow I had put 3 of these syllables together in a certain order and a certain rhythm that sounded like a really rude word in Japanese. And so we had to change it.
That's so funny. But they are. I heard you correctly. You said that those chants are actually essentially just sounds. They're not actually words.
No, they're not words. They're just sounds, like you learn it in music all the time. Like I don't know what system you learn, but they're different ones. But I learned rhythm with ta ta te ta ta. There's like they're different things. Or you could learn like solfege, do re mi, so fa la. It's just like a set of musical words that has become traditional for taiko drummers to say.
Yeah, that's funny. I've listened to that. I've been to performances of amazing taiko ensembles, and I somehow never realized that that's where that was coming from. That's great. Well, if that's the worst of your cultural missteps, I would say you did quite well. One other question though that pops to mind is one of the touted and honestly very cool aspects of the game is its the Kurosawa mode, and this kind of love letter to Japanese cinema, in the same, kind of on the other hand, as its a loyalty to this wildly different time period of feudal Japan. And the thing that's interesting is a lot of those Kurosawa films have very kind of brusque, almost modernist orchestral scores that are very intense, to say the least. And I didn't really pick up any of that in your work, but I just found myself curious if there was ever, given the importance of Kurosawa's spirit in the game, if there was ever any flirtation with something along those lines.
I think the ambition for the music was really far removed from that. And I think as much as I am as big a fan of Kurosawa as anybody, and I love those scores, but there's something a little old-fashioned about them.
Oh,
they're amazing works of art for their moment in time, and in fact, and also sometimes they do use Japanese melody, or something that sounds a little bit Japanese in the orchestra, but I feel almost in the modern context it almost sounds like it's sort of been appropriated in an inappropriate kind of a way. And I think that if I'd started writing orchestral music in fifths and fourths and that sort of thing that we would that's even some of the great classical composers did. If you listen to
Puccini or Verdi,
or Tchaikovsky doing the Chinese music in the Nutcracker, I think it almost sounds like it's bordering on racist, and so
it's very reductive.
I
think needless to say, Tchaikovsky did not spend a day with a Japan via Spain scholar on a given instrument and a professor of Japanese musicology, and
so exactly. So the aspiration for authenticity, which came from their, from Sucker Punch's aspiration for authenticity, that inspired me for me to say, well, I'm going to do the same thing with the music. Led me really far away from any kind of Kurosawa score.
Yeah, I kind of figured, but I was curious if there was even a temptation, because the Kurosawa mode in the game is just so cool and so striking that it would have been potentially tempting to pay similar homage musically.
Yeah, I can totally see why, and it could have gone that way, and it would have been a very different kind of score.
Yeah, and probably not quite the gripping world imagination capturing one. So before we close it out here, and I appreciate you indulging a lot of inquiry on my part.
No, it's great.
Something that's completely unrelated to any of this, but I would just love to hear a few words on, is we both, around the same time, did a project which, in the broadest possible sense, could be described as a musical love letter to science. Yours, I don't know actually how much yours was specifically catered towards the science aspect of it, but your collaboration with the European Space Agency it's very fun. I don't know if you're aware of a project that I worked on, because I think we were both working with Chandler Poling in tandem.
What was your one?
It's called A Light in the Void, and it was basically a TED conference with scientists where I set their talks about their work to music, and we performed it with a full orchestra, where they would speak while the orchestra plays as if it was a dramatic monologue, and then interwoven with some actors doing some kind of theater-esque elaboration on what the scientists had been getting into.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I've got to. Will you send me a link? I've got to have Is it? Did they video it?
Yeah, we streamed it, and there's a recording, and I will happily do so.
Oh, man,
one of the scientists,
love to see that.
I think it would be up your alley. And one of our scientists, the kind of finale of the show, was Carolyn Porco, who was the lead imaging scientist on the Cassini probe,
right,
which had just prior to our premiere done its suicide dive after a 20-year mission into the atmosphere of Saturn. And so it quite piqued my interest to see your project. And so just I've read a bit about it, but pretend I haven't, and just tell myself and our listeners a bit about that, because it was a beautiful thing and really exciting.
Well, I think the easiest way to explain it is to talk about how it came to be. So what happened is I got followed on Twitter by somebody from the European Space Agency. So of course I followed back, because who wouldn't?
Right.
And
yeah, exactly.
For those who in America, the European Space Agency is our version of NASA, and
I think everybody with any interest in this became keenly aware of the ESA when the asteroid landing occurred.
Right.
Blanking on the name of it of the lander, but that was a very much an ESA baby that captured our attention very much here.
So they and this guy said, well, look, the astronaut Tim Peake, British astronaut, is a fan of your music, and would you mind having a chat with him? So of course. So I spoke with Tim, and he said, look, I'm about to go up to the International Space Station, and when we're up there, we make these films, and the films always have really bad music on it, and I really like your music, and would you consider doing some music for me? And I was like, I mean, yeah. I mean, if an astronaut asks you to write some music, you're going to say yes, right? So
Yeah, I can't ever imagine a scenario of going, well, I have to choose my collaborators very carefully.
yeah, right.
Not so sure you make the cut.
So then he said, well, look, the thing is that, we don't have any money because we spend all our money on space travel. And I thought, well, yeah, that's fair enough. And he said, and I said, well, that's fine. No worries. Just invite me to the rocket launch. And he said, well, that's actually a bit tricky because, it's in Kazakhstan on a Russian spaceport. It's really hard to get to, and people aren't really allowed to go there. Because at that time, before Elon Musk's rocket was just recently taking people up to the space station, the Russian Soyuz was the only way up and down to the space station. But he said, so, I can't do that for you, but why don't you come visit me at NASA Johnson? And so I went to the Johnson Space Center and spent a couple of days getting the tour that money can't buy. I got to go on the replica space station, try on bits of a spacesuit. It was really one of the most inspiring times of my life. And I had a great dinner with Tim. And by the end of it, I thought, why are we making a 6-minute film? Like, why don't we make like a big giant show and we could tour it, and you could talk about space, and I could talk about, I could play some music, and that's how the project came into being. And my thought about it was that, there's a lot of information about space travel, about the International Space Station, a lot of science, and what I wanted to do was try and bring across the emotional side of it. What is it? Because I think all the astronauts would agree that it's a profoundly changing experience being up there. And one of the astronauts said to me, when you go up to the space station, you one of the things that really dawns on you in like a big way is that the astronauts spend all their time looking out of this module called the cupola. It's got 6 windows and a circular window at the bottom, and you get like really good images of Earth, and they love staring down at our home. And they and as you stare down at the home, the astronaut said, you realize that we're all stuck on this giant ball traveling through space, and that we've got to look after the vessel we're traveling on and the people we're traveling with, otherwise we're not going to survive. And that really hit me. And I thought, if I can in some way musically, through music and images, express that sentiment, then that emotional sentiment, and that thing that in one way or another all the astronauts experience, anyway, that's what I wanted to attempt to do. And it's great that we're talking about it right now today, because today is the year anniversary of our first and sadly only concert because of COVID-19, but was the debut concert that we did in Stockholm. And it's actually exactly 5 minutes till we walked onto stage a year ago, performed it for the first time to 10,000 people who stayed the whole time and didn't leave. I was very relieved to see by the end of it.
That's just incredible. What a beautiful everything. Every aspect of that. I resonate more than I could articulate. And that's fantastic. And I think it really highlights where this conversation began, of asking yourself, what kinds of projects do you want to do? We don't have unlimited time in life and unlimited bandwidth to put our efforts towards, and the things that we choose to use that bandwidth for better mean something. My little phrase I often say is, the thing I write today should hopefully be something that justifies being the last thing I ever wrote in case I walk out the door and get run over by a bus. And there being it not just functional in life, or ideally, hopefully, if you're lucky enough, it's not just there to put food on the table or make sure the bills are paid, but can actually speak to something deeper or more important. to you.
Yeah.
And you seem to exemplify that in ways that I've admired your work for years, but I had no idea that this kind of consideration in your work. But it really, I'm connecting the dots here over the last hour and change, and it's just wonderful.
Yeah, well, great. Well, thank you, and I feel like we're kindred spirits on that journey. So it's been great chatting to you about all of it.
Well, the pleasure is absolutely mine. I hope that, and it's hard to imagine it won't be the case, that Ghosts leads to a proliferation of further game work from you, and certainly such that it also doesn't damper on your theater, ballet, film, television, and Spaceship Earth writing as well. I don't want to engage in an Ilan Eshkeri zero-sum game of overtaxation on your musical output, but I certainly think that we would benefit from hearing your music in games more and more. But if nothing else, a hell of a job well done on Ghosts of Tsushima, and thanks for getting into it with me.
Great. Well, thanks very much for having me on the show.
Thank you for joining us for the Game Maker's Notebook. For more information on the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, our podcasts, and our other initiatives, please visit www.interactive.org.